that type of a hypothetical question is never going to come up in your daily life. If it did come up, if suppose there was some ancient, some alien civilization that came and gave us that weird situation, well then morality becomes meaningless, because we evolve on this planet to be moral creatures, to care, to empathize, to feel, to not want to see little babies being hurt. I mean, we'll stick a needle into them and we'll do a few little things here and there, but in general to torture, that would never be morally right. Someone in some cold alien civilization, perhaps that's non-human, might be able to do some mathematical calculation and say, well, babies are dying and tortured all the time, so if that happened, they might be able to make a utilitarian case. But I would not want to be in the position of doing that, and I couldn't be the person to do that. I would say, if I were called on to do something like that, I'd say, well, if our human species is to such a point where one of us could do something like that, then we're not worth living. We may as well all die off anyway, because what's the point if we don't have those values?
You had talked about harm, the avoidance of harm, or the minimizing of harm being the basis for morality. We don't always define harm, though, in terms of humanity. When we talk about needing to protect endangered species and spending resources and displacing people and that kind of a thing. What is the standard or the ability to use the harm if you don't base it on humanity itself, but beyond that?
Yeah, because part of our nature is living within a natural environment. So we live in a natural environment which needs to have some good hygiene, or else our own species is threatened if our environment and the other species on this planet as well. So most humanists go beyond mere humanism, and they extend the values to the other animals of which we are a part. By the way, other animals, other primates and mammals and species do exhibit moral sensibilities that you'll find among chimpanzees and whales and dolphins and other species. Giving, caring, sacrificing, empathy, grieving, you'll find a lot of that within the other species as well. So we are a part of a huge web of other living beings as well as the planet that we live on. So most humanists that I know would extend the principle of using humanity as the measure for human values and say that all of life, all of the species, has its value relative to where they fit within that chain of being.
I just think that harm, it's hard to just link morality to that greater harm of the species. There's a little harm we cannot really detect in our short-sighted view of things, in the small things. And we have experience of that bad moral things that we do, and we're tempted to do, in lack of kindness or truthfulness, or being not that open to someone that I should help. It's hard to know, it's hard to really measure the harm that is introduced in humanity in relations by those things. That's why I think revealed morality is so helpful, because it actually says, well, honor father and mother, do not commit adultery and such, which would be so hard to measure. Well, what's the damage of adultery in the equation? It's just calculating an overall damage in society and so.
Do you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible?
I do. I believe, though, that as a church believes, and it's not my personal take on this, I believe that the Bible teaches how to live, how to honor God, how to do things right. And that's a purpose. It leads us to God, leads us to salvation. It's not a book meant to teach us anthropological details, the history of ancient peoples. It's not mainly a manual of history or science. It's a book that leads us to God, to understand who we are, how we are to behave. And so the truth that the Bible teaches is ordered to that, to salvation, to morality, to understand how to honor God, and such things. It's not a book, as some took it as a book to calculate scientific data from it. And though I agree that it's hard to separate what is historical from what is the content, the intended content. Some things are, some histories are told with an intention to teach something, like the story of Jonah, for example, and some stories are real stories, the Exodus from Egypt, the invasion of Holy Land and such. There's some historical basis for that. But it's hard to discriminate in every single case. Well, was Abraham, did this happen to Abraham or not? Or is to teach something behind that story? So that's hard to, even exegetes have a hard time always knowing what is the actual historicity of this particular story in the Bible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Scholars and theologians are always wondering where you draw that line. Obviously, even the fundamentalist inerrantist, born-again evangelical, knows there's metaphor in the Bible. When Jesus said, "I am the door," you don't look for hinges. I mean, you know that there's talking in figurative language. And so that Adam and Eve could have been just like the prodigal son. The prodigal son didn't exist. It was just a story that Jesus made up to teach a truth. So the Israelites could have made up the story of Adam and Eve to teach a truth. So how do you know what's real and what isn't? What a lot of us say is, well, then if there is metaphor, and since the Bible is contradictory, unhistorical, unscientific, and immoral, and ahistorical in many ways, well then, why do you draw the line here? Why don't you say, well, if the prodigal son is a parable, Adam and Eve are a metaphor, God himself is also a big figure of speech. The whole thing is one big metaphor. Why can't you just put the whole thing within the big circle of metaphor and quit pretending that God's a real thing? It was a story, a parable that the human race made to explain existence. You have no criteria for knowing where to draw that line.
Sorry, I have to move on.
Yeah.
Mr. Barker, how does objective morality explain the conscience of individual humans and the agreed conclusion as to whether something is right or wrong without ever needing to consult others or create some societal basis?
Instincts. We have evolved instincts that when I reached for that baby, did I deliberate? Did I think? Did I try to apply some articulated moral philosophy to my actions? I instinctively did that. We all have unconscious, subconscious, instinctive knowing about right and wrong that we got from our ancestors. A lot of it. A lot of it doesn't work today because we now live in a different environment in which we evolve. So sometimes we have to check our instincts. We have to watch. That's why we have this frontal lobe, the most recently developed part of the brain, which, by the way, doesn't finish developing until about the age of 25 or so, and it happens faster in women than in men, which probably explains a lot, that we can override our instincts. It's what's keeping you from burping out loud right now. You might feel like it, but you're holding back. We have this rational part of our brain which tries to control the instincts. So there's a lot of things that we all just know instinctively without having to put into words. If you wanted to stop and think it through, you could say, yeah, we evolve those tendencies because they result in less harm, less threat to the species. But there's a whole lot of things that you and I just, little babies, they instinctively know what fairness is. If I give Johnny a bag of candy and I say, I want you to share this with your sister. So he goes over and he gives her one piece. What does the sister think? Instinctively, we know that without having to talk it through. Even kids, before they can talk, they understand fairness. We come pre-packaged with a lot of moral sentiments that we inherited from our ancestors, which is a good start towards us becoming a species that survives with compassion, altruism, cooperation, and sharing.
I would say instinct is not enough for the foundation of morality. You said instinct. I reached out to grab this baby, but if it had been a year younger in the mother's womb, it was accept to kill that baby. So how can it be? I mean, how that amazing change? Or how can I, who disagree with abortion, how can I go so far against instinct? And if that the instinctive thing is to agree that killing the embryo is great, is a fine thing to do, how can I, for example, be so far detached from instincts? Can a human being do that? Can I be completely uninstinctive, if that word exists?
You made up a new word, that's good.
Next question, please.
Father, you argue that there is a natural morality embedded in nature, and that if we look at nature, we see a certain consistency of moral behavior. But in fact, if we look at nature, there's an absolute lack of moral behavior. I mean, animals devour their own young routinely, they commit infanticide, there is social cheating behavior. Animals can even lie for their own benefit with their behavior. So doesn't this imply an absolute lack of any natural moral law and that morality is a human construct?
Natural morality doesn't mean that it's taken from the animal world. We human beings are in between the spiritual world, and so we combine both the physical, biological, instinctive, and the spiritual, which is a very, it's a very unique thing. I know that we disagree on this point, but we are in the middle of the two realms, spirit and matter, and our nature is. Our natural law, in a way, guides us on how to live in a healthy way, in a good way, that dual, in a way, existence. So we don't take our morality from the animal world. I would say animals don't have a morality. They don't have free choice, they don't have conscience. What they do, as Mr. Barker says, instinctively. They don't do it out of free choice, so they cannot be really condemned, or they're not killing others. They're not doing homicide or caticide or dogicide. They do instinctively. So, but we don't act by instinct. We have a free will, and so it's what I mean is different. That there are tendencies in us that are natural, but they are spiritual. So the love you have for your children is not just animal instinct. It's of a different nature. It's a different kind of love, but you have to follow that. That's what I mean by that. And if you don't follow it, if I'd say, I decided I'm going to live selfishly. I want to get the best of life, have fun, and live in a selfish way. I don't care to love anyone around me. I just want to get all the benefits.